All right. So we're going to start in 1 second. But first, let's make sure this doesn't crash like it did last time. All right. Okay. All right. So it's almost the new year, and there's great China news to talk about really quickly. So the really important main story here is basically the Beijing Winter Olympics, 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics are basically here. And these are going to be the Omicron Olympics. If there ever had been a public health disaster Olympics staring everyone in the face, it's never been as bad as this one. So I'm just going to really quickly talk about how we have like a diplomatic disaster going on with this already. I talked about it briefly in the Peng Shuai video, just about how countries are abandoning the Olympics. They're using it to, poke China in the face and all that kind of stuff. And that's just the way it is. Now, on top of that, there's a health disaster. So we'll talk about how COVID is in China, talk about the government's policies, talk about the Olympics, talk about what to expect. And yeah, let's get into it. I mean, like I was saying, this diplomatic disaster is already not good, right? What Beijing wanted was Beijing 2008, those Olympics, the sort of coming out party that it had. It wanted that again. It wanted to just see that again. It wanted the whole world to come to China to see how great it is, to see how much more it had advanced, 14 years later, right? The 2008 Olympics, it was a really impressive show. Everyone, I mean, not everyone remembers it, but it was memorable. It was like, wow, like this is happening. And then there was the financial crisis. The U.S. seemed to just be on the decline, and all this stuff was terrible. And then you had Beijing. It just seemed like, oh my God, this is the new kid on the block, right? So Beijing loved that event. It was phenomenal for it. It was, for the party loved the publicity. It loved everything about that. So it pushed really hard for the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, which is kind of crazy. Beijing is not the place to have Olympics in the first place. It's just like you can do it in Salt Lake City. You can do it in outside of Vancouver, do it places that have a lot of typical snow, but whatever. They can just make the snow appear. That doesn't really matter. They wanted it back in Beijing. They didn't want it anywhere else in China. They wanted it in Beijing, where the central authorities were. And then it was going to be another, gala, another massive performance showing the world how, oh, you thought we were amazing in 2008 before we had high-speed rail that just crisscrossed the entire country, before we were 30% of global manufacturing, before this, before that, before the Belt and Road, before Xi Jinping, before all of this, right? I mean, that was an old administration. I don't know, administration is not the right word for what's going on in China, but still, that was pre-Xi Jinping era, right? So that didn't pull to him. It didn't pull to the current leadership, all those benefits. They see that event and they think that'll be great. And so what we've been seeing is how starting with the United States, called and finally decided to call the Xinjiang, everything going on in Xinjiang, a genocide, and it decided to basically boycott the Olympics diplomatically, not to still send athletes, but to boycott the Olympics. And then all these other countries decided to do the same thing, right? If you're, Australia or a lot of other countries, you decide to do it. Other countries decide, hey, we're going to still go, blah, blah, blah. But everything's just sort of piling up now. And now there's just a health disaster that's just brewing with these Olympics, right? Omicron is infecting everyone. It's super infectious. It's like the most infectious disease humanity has ever encountered at this point. It's not as lethal, it doesn't look like, but it's super infectious. It's just going to infect everybody. There's almost no way to stop it because the current vaccines don't actually have the protection you want. And that really matters in China because China's vaccines basically have no protection at all. And so it obviously was using the vaccines. It was using its sort of potential role in ending the virus as a way to make up for what it was doing for causing the virus, basically, right? That was early on too. In 2020, it was sending supplies and medical devices and medical equipment and medical, personal protective equipment, all that kind of stuff to Europe, to the United States, and it was almost was trying to become the arsenal of medicine, right, to help defeat this global public health disaster. That was sort of the propaganda move, literally the propaganda move. The propaganda department was trying to push on the world, on trying to help redeem its credibility and all that kind of stuff in the world. And that didn't exactly work out, right? The American vaccines turned out to be way better, the only ones that actually work at all with the virus, although at this point it's getting pretty weird. But the the key thing here is that China still has a zero tolerance policy for COVID, right? That means that it's like the only major country anywhere in the world that's still trying to do this, because it's insane. I have another video you can listen to about why this is just a bananas sort of idea to do with this sort of disease that COVID has morphed into, right? So it's not the same disease. This is like version 7 or 8 or whatever of this disease, or 20, you never know. There's all these other ones, but it's a completely different thing. And zero tolerance means you don't allow a single case to, spread, right? You don't allow it to become, to basically to infect people, right? It doesn't want it to become endemic. It doesn't want it to be something like the flu or whatever, which just keeps appearing, which is what's going to happen everywhere in the world. There's unlikely there's any way to stop that. And China has just been fighting that, right? It basically banked its whole credibility, the government's credibility, on we are going to totally defeat COVID. I mean, people should remember 2020 and spring and summer of 2020, it was building hospitals. It was locking everything down. It was the first country to do this lockdown. It, in a lot of ways, inspired a lot of the rest of the world to do that. And it was a crazy mobilization of security resources and all sorts of authorities within the country to make a whole push to basically wipe out COVID within China, which it did, eventually did, even though it kind of fudged all sorts of numbers. That doesn't really matter at this point, but that's what happened. And so that was a massive boost to the Communist Party's credibility. It was like, oh my God, this country can actually, unlike all these other pathetic Western European and American, whatever countries who can't deal with this virus, China can just knock it out. Totally. Goodbye. Yeah, it formed in our country, but still goodbye. You get kicked out, and the whole rest of the world had to deal with it. Right? So that was one of the ways it redeemed its credibility, particularly in China, with regards to COVID, right? Like, how did you let this happen, right? This is the origins, not even the origins question. It's like, how did this happen on your watch? If you guys are so amazing, why did you allow, or how did this virus even spew out of your country? Well, that's a harder question for it to answer. So it said, hey, let's bunt on that. And then instead, we'll just say, look at this. We just knocked it out. The rest of the world, they not our fault they can't handle it, right? And then we'll give them some, masks and stuff to help them, but we don't really expect much, right? That was sort of the move. And that was a whole, it's more than just like a policy. This was one of those things where this whole crisis was like SARS. I have some podcasts about this people should listen to. Like it was like SARS. It was very much a seriously threatening thing to the Chinese government, which relies on the Chinese people's vision of the government as super competent, as able to create economic growth, to keep people healthy, to deal with to reunify Taiwan, to handle the United States, do all the kind of stuff like that. So that is what it's based off of. And based on what it did in 2020, China the government just stuck to this idea that, well, we knocked it out of the country, so we're never, ever letting it back in. There's never going to be COVID in this country. We're going to vaccinate people. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And then really what happens is we're just going to keep shutting things down. So this is just the update, basically the bullet point update in China of COVID is like, they still have a zero tolerance policy, which means no COVID at all. They have vaccines that don't really work. The new Omicron variant is insanely contagious. So the combination of no protection, basically, because there's no natural protection for people who are infected and now have natural immunity, and there's no strong antibody, like sort of vaccine medical protection. So there's no protection at all, and you're not allowing any of it. So basically, the second there's a single case that comes in from anywhere, things get shut down. So key infrastructure all around China is constantly getting shut down. Ports being one of the most common ones because you have goods and people and stuff coming in from outside the rest of the world. And then there's whole cities, like just a couple days ago. I mean, there was Xi'an, which is a major city in northern China, north central China, and it's 12, 14 million people, depending on how you want to calculate it. The whole thing got shut down. Everybody gets tested, and it's the same thing they've been doing, really, of just mass shutdowns of individual cities, cordoning them off, and doing mass testing of it, right? With very brutal sort of lockdowns involved. Other people are now so used to it that doesn't really mean that much. But this is a crazy this is a crazy way of going about it, right? First of all, you're a major production node in the entire world global economy, right? How are you supposed to be the world's factory if you can't let people and goods and all sorts of things just flow and move within your country, right? this is actually undermining China's basic role in the world economy, right? So right now, there are massive supply chain problems all around the world in every industry, and they're going to continue for a few years in various ways. And one of the driving pushes behind how to respond to this is, well, maybe we should stop with these super cost-effective but super fragile supply chains in all sorts of industries, right? So originally it was just masks, then it moved to all sorts of devices, it moved to cars, it moved to semiconductors, but now it's really just kind of anything in a lot of ways, like medical equipment, right? There's so many things. I also have another podcast on people should listen to about how there's, we're moving away from all these just-in-time, it's not even just in time. It's like, this is what a real supply chain is. It's like, let's take advantage of global tax and labor arbitrage all around the world. Let's make every single part in the precise place where it is cheapest to do that for tax reasons and labor reasons. So let's get the absolute cheapest labor, the absolute cheapest cost, and then often all these regulatory things. So let's get the absolute cheapest, worst environmental regulations, worst labor regulations, worst everything. Least amount of health benefits, least amount of everything. That was really what it was. And that's just what it was, right? Not even a moral judgment about this. That's just the way it worked. But now it's very different because there was a world that allowed this. There was the transportation systems that allowed the global supply chains to function, right? That was particularly all the maritime trade. There was the information systems that allowed companies to keep track of everything that was going on, right? Every little part, you could track it. You could see, its quality. You could make sure it was functioning. You could make sure it was where it needed to be. All of this stuff was, major innovation that happened starting in the 60s, really ramping up in the 80s, and then just proceeding all the way through the next 30, 40 years. And this is the system that made China, right? And that is just a very different world from the one we live in right now, right? And there's all sorts of reasons I get into in other videos about why this stuff is a much deeper than the sort of local, oh my God, well, we can't do this right now just because there's a problem at the port and there's a problem here. No, these are major structural changes going on in all sorts of industries, in labor markets, and in everything, right? And even in the government's perspective, right? It used to be, pretty hands-off. Everybody in the 90s, especially, there was all these protests against the WTO, against everything. I mean, against all sorts of world trade. The unions were still stronger back then. Everything. I mean, there's those Seattle protests. There was all the stuff about the major regional and global, trade deals, right? So there's NAFTA. There's all these things that people in the United States back then, particularly on the left, were aghast about. They're like, you're just destroying families, communities, jobs, everything. But it passed, right? Like all that went through, and that was the world we had to live in. And now there's still a lot of the wreckage of that stuff. There's also some good things, but there's also a lot of particularly social and cultural sort of wreckage that accompanied it. And that is now, that's part of what we've known. Like that's part of the history. So there's a major push to say, hey, we messed that up. Let's rebuild this in a different way. So you look at Biden, you look at Trump, they're both super buy American, basically economic nationalism, variations of protectionism, variations on, hey, this unfettered global trade doesn't work anymore. And it's not even just like an academic, like, oh, this is like a weird optimization problem for an economist. It's like, no, it's like there's categories of goods. And you need them at certain times. There are major, natural disasters. There's all these things that just require certain goods. And, and there's always been this sense of strategic industries, right? Places like France have always been very big about having all these strategic industries. And the United States does as well, particularly for defense industries, defense products, defense goods. But it's now just expanding to be almost everything. It's basically expanding to the point where if you're a country like the United States that can basically have all sorts of goods, all sorts of services, all sorts of almost everything built within, if not in the United States, then in North America or in places that aren't connected to countries you don't like. Like the United States, you use the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, Canada, NAFTA, North America. You use some of but you link in with a bunch of, a couple South American countries like the Colombia. And then there's some countries, even like, Morocco for certain important, agricultural commodities, stuff like that. There's all these little countries that they're not like in the middle of a giant, firestorm, right? You're not Saudi Arabia. You're not, unfortunately, Taiwan is actually in a firestorm, but all of that, right? You're not near all these giant problem sites. So there's a lot of ways where that can happen. Not always. Not on all industries, particularly not in semiconductors, which is why the China thing and East Asia, South Asia as well, with like Malaysia, which is really important, sort of the mid-tier of a lot of these semiconductors. This stuff isn't going away. But it's also no longer just a, hey, let's let every random business, optimize for themselves their supply chains without any consideration of everything that people have just gone through since 2020, right? So this whole thing is just a massive transformation of everything that's going on. And China, with its COVID policies, is basically adding more fuel to this fire. It's like, okay, we all know that we're going to change some things now that this whole crisis has happened and there's no longer, everything doesn't just flow in super easily into the country. And then China's there literally shutting down massive ports, shutting down whole cities. And you add in like sort of not the labor problems, you add in the energy problems, all these things that are going on in China. This is unwinding a lot of its role in many, many industries. And there's a lot of industries where this hasn't even happened yet, right? Because every business, every CEO, every sort of major decision maker in a lot of these organizations doesn't exactly know yet how far to push things. Do they say, oh, okay, this is really bad, everything going on with China, let's just pull out? But what do you do with the millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of dollars of investment that you have in China, right? And China's become so optimal for assembling and manufacturing things that there's so many things that keep you in the country, right? There's so many pure, localized, useful, suppliers, everything, sub-manufacturers, everything that really, it's been optimized to be this production node for the world economy. How do you know how far to push it, right? So that's part of what, even me talking about this stuff, it's like, well, people have to have a sense, a context for where things are actually going. Well, is this all just going to blow over, right? Will the United States and China particularly the United States and China get over things and it'll all just get better, get normal, whatever. This isn't going to happen. That's something for another day. But what's happening now with the COVID policies is just super basic. It's like the Chinese government is less interested in its role in this world economy, particularly because it knows this stuff is happening, right? They are not stupid. They are misguided and blinkered in all sorts of ways and focused on other things. But the Communist Party is really not dumb. And they know that their position in the world economy does not function for many reasons the same way now as it will in 2030. There's no way that happens. So they're less concerned really with all this stuff than with purely maintaining their credibility and sense of competence within the country, which is currently wedded to zero tolerance, just totally defeat COVID. And they're happily willing to just shut down all these cities and shut down all these ports. It doesn't really matter to them. They are just more concerned with basically internal Chinese political stability, which has its own major problems that you just can't handle just by dealing with COVID, right? Like at this point, it's kind of ironic. Like COVID is not the worst thing that China is going to be, confronted with. So it is weird that it's been wed to these policies, but let's be honest here. Every government and particularly the left-right political spectrum in all these countries, everybody got wedded to a certain idea of what was right and what had to be done for COVID, usually sometime last year. So, on the left, there was a focus, and I'll use the American left and right here. The American left, it was a focus on vaccines. It was a focus on testing. It was a focus on having the proper proper messaging in public health organizations, and have a good sense of everybody coming together, having proper leadership at the top, blah, blah, blah. That was one set of policies. And then on the right, it was more, we need to limit this. It was not, this is like a flu. It is not as terrible. There's, certain things are impingements on liberty in the same, instead of, for secure, apparent security, which maybe isn't needed. So they protested, masks, they protested certain imposition of vaccines, all these kind of things, right? And forget which is right, which is wrong. What we need to remember is that this is a fluid and dynamic situation, right? You don't want to get wedded to, oh my God, vaccines are everything. A year and a half later, right? Realistically, and I actually, I'm vaccinated. I think people should get vaccinated. I think it's a very smart thing to do, just based on the science. I don't think this is not going to kill you. It's basically the most tested thing you can find, just medically. It's rarely ever been a data set this big. And you would see all sorts of things before, but that doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. The truth is still, that being said, this vaccine, which I just said all that good stuff for, is also the, I mean, this is a vaccine for version 1 of the virus that is now on version, like I said, 15, 7, 10, 15, 20. It's not, the answer is really no longer to keep doing boosters for things. And we're in a very weird place, right, in a regulatory and technological sort of sense. So the ability to modify and transform mRNA vaccines very quickly and very effectively is really phenomenal. Like they can whip up a new version of this vaccine in like days. It's really just a computer program. That is, however, not how the regulatory system works. It's not how the FDA works. That's not how the approval timeline for any of this stuff works. So the way it worked is like it used to take years. So everyone was really impressed they even managed to make a vaccine this quickly, right? Remember, go back March 2010, March, February 2020, people were like, oh my God, will we ever have a vaccine? Will it be like AIDS or HIV where it's just, you didn't figure out something for years and years and we just live with it. There's all sorts of very nightmare scenarios for how this could have played out. But instead, we got a vaccine pretty quickly. And, turns out that, of the 7 to 10 year timeline or whatever of a vaccine, like 80% of it is all just trying to get the financing. So you got the financing right away. And then you get rid of some other stuff and you basically use an mRNA vaccine and it basically becomes a year just to test it and get it approved by the FDA. That's literally, it was just basically a regulatory timeline from the time you had it, in the lab, which was basically, apparently they actually, Moderna and Pfizer, or whichever, Janssen and the other one, BioNTech, like those companies, they had basically the exact vaccine that they used for the first version of the virus for COVID-19 in like January, February. Like it was of 2020. It was like that quick. It was weeks. It was really weeks. But you do obviously have to test all this stuff, right? We have still a massive blowback, particularly in the United States, against vaccines, in part because people were worried about a sense that it was safe or not, right? Is it safe? This happened so quickly. How do you know? Blah, blah, blah. So you can't just, even if you can make it really quickly, you need buy-in, right? Like you can't, it's like if you had cars and you had seatbelts and the seatbelts just looked pathetic and they didn't, you couldn't prove that they actually could help you, right? And they were like pink and made of, I don't know, like tinfoil. It's like, well, this is not going to work. Like no one would trust it, right? So it needs to have that sense of, backing. You need to see studies. You want to have, people want that sense of confirmation that has been reviewed and that it actually works, right? It builds a sense of, it makes you trust it. So you have to do that, right? But that being said, it's still a weird place because you have the technology that can move so quickly, and this is kind of a different discussion. But the FDA, the way it does things, there's a lot of innovation going on in biotech right now, and there are a lot of ways in which the FDA is way too slow. But how do you manage continuing to build that trust that people need to get all this stuff? Although people do get all sorts of weird vitamins and all sorts of bizarre things all the time that are completely unregulated by anybody, and they just love it and they get it anyway. So who knows what people actually need? But in this case, at least of a vaccine and the way it's talked about, people want that confidence. How do you do that? How do you manage the massive technological speed that you now have to make things and getting this proper data? So that's like a separate sort of issue. But this is just the problem, like I was saying, is just that people are getting wedded to these ideas. So like I was saying, the left had that, basically super vaccine focused and less interested in sort of, testing or allowing it to run through the population. That was seen to be morally bad and to be wrong and to let all sorts of people die. And, the right was like, well, this is just the flu, blah, blah, we'll just let this happen. And, that also had its problems, obviously, all this kind of stuff. But now it's just, we have to remember this is a different virus. Like this is a totally different virus. This is super infectious, less deadly, but like insanely infectious. Like it is a different scenario, right? So the point being is left and right. I mean, obviously first stop hating each other as much, but I don't know if that's possible, but still you have to be willing to look again at what you were believing, right? So for example, if boosters, if the only thing that makes for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, if you need a booster for it to really be effective, and maybe 20-30% of the population has a booster, and you're unlikely to ramp that up in the time that you need, it's like, well, this thing is going to just rip through the population. That's what's going to happen, right? And so then it's like, and it's another battle of like, well, how do we handle this? Do we do it? All those stuff, right? Do you lock it down? Do you do this? Do that? This whole thing is coming again. People just need to remember it's a different it's a different virus. People at a different place, right? All that kind of stuff matters. And I bring all this up because it happens, it matters in the West as well. But in China, this is just even more rigid in every single way, because you can't, first of all, the population has no role in this. Like, part of the reason you have all these varieties of opinions in the United States is because all these, people have ideas and they're allowed to express them, and they're allowed to, enact their beliefs basically in various ways. You don't do that in China. So there's no one who's been protesting the Chinese government policy, right? There's obviously academics in China who say this and say that and say we should change course or whatever, but that's not it. There's not like massive protests about different policies like you saw in like Australia or whatever. Like that doesn't happen. So this is always one of those situations where the way that a government, like in particular like China, works is that it tries to, and this is really not a lot of authoritarian regimes have this level of competence, ironically, that they're trying to say that basically China is more, it doesn't need to be representative like a democracy, which it now sees as useless. And there's a lot of problems with democracies right now, like around the world, like practically, not like intellectually or ideologically. Like there's just a lot of clear problems in the way democracies are functioning. And it looks at them and says, we don't need that. We don't need that at all. It looks Chinese people. What do you want this massive chaos you see in Western Europe and the United States, all this stuff, this endless argument, all that. No, we don't need that. What it says is, instead of being representative, basically we are responsive, right? One way to think about it is like, hey, we're responsive to you and your needs, just like a corporation is responsive to its consumers for giving them higher quality products and services, goods and services. That is one way to think about what it's doing. And it's actually a very, very good way to think about how it thinks about itself, even though it's not right. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons why we could talk about that, but this is one way to think about it. And in China, the problem with this, one of them, is just that you don't quite know the response, what the people are thinking, right? So obviously you have massive data collection now, but people aren't allowed to say the things that they believe, right? So and you can look at behavior, right? You can look at what people do, but people have very circumscribed lives in general. Like, how does what you do in your daily life tell you what your massive beliefs are on, grand social questions? And this is kind of a weird thing where even in the West, you don't have a forum for people to talk about these things, and there's no control over the outcomes or the processes. So if you're a random country, small country like, I don't know, Latvia or something, or whatever, it could be Hungary or something like that, in Europe, and a lot of the things that matter to you are decided at the EU level of your country, or the EU level of your region, right? Because there's a super national organization there that deals with that has control over a lot of things. You can't even influence this, right? It's literally bureaucrats in another place. So what kind of national discussion can you have on different issues, right? There's huge problems with all this stuff. And that is China's real problem, is that it gets so wedded to these ideas, to these old bad ideas about what to do, that it is very hard for things to change. And one of the things that's happened since the basically, let's say 80s to mid 2010s, was that China had so many changes going on within the country. Like, it had all modernized basically. And that by itself, just the level of change going on within the country, made the Communist Party far more nimble and far more responsive, literally, than, well, first of all, any communist party ever. Obviously not any, there's only one Chinese Communist Party, but any communist party ever, which are typically so rigid that you get Cubas, right? Stuff like that. It doesn't work. But the level of change required them to constantly change and adapt. There was just no other, there was no other way. They set a ball rolling and they had to keep moving with it, right? And that was really powerful. But things are very much changing in China, as anyone who's listening to the news kind of knows and sees. You look at tech, you look at every area of their country. And it's part of it is because they're shifting into a very different phase. The level China has modernized, right? Not every part of China, but the parts of China that will modernize have modernized. And this is a very different world. Like, things are now settling down. Like, the level of economic growth, everything is settling. It's coming back down. And the Communist Party in general is becoming far more irresponsible, non-responsive, I guess, to these things. And it doesn't have the best mechanisms to actually gauge what the population is thinking, right? There's obviously huge problems with democracies and with just doing political elections here and there, and that doesn't give you the best answers, right? That's a minor, basically a popularity contest every few years. Doesn't tell you all that many things, right? That's fair. But and you can collect all sorts of data now. So you can collect people's purchases. You can collect all this stuff. The real challenge, though, is how do you actually, like, if someone's just, let's say you're a white collar worker in Hangzhou or somewhere near a place near Shanghai, and you just look about their day, you look what they purchased, you look at this, you look at that. What exactly is that telling you about where the country should go? Right? There are deeper, sort of communication issues that a society and its government need to work out. Channels of communication need to form for these things to actually work and be durable. There's very little of that in China that works. And well, I'll leave that for another time. But where this is all leading is that, getting back to the Olympics, the massive Omicron Olympics that are coming for China, is that this is just turning into a disaster, right? You have a super rigid government that is wedded to outdated COVID policies, that has already had a diplomatic blowback about everything, right? Because the people are boycotting the Olympics in part. Yeah, it's because of Xinjiang. It's also because of just China. It's because of everything it's doing, including COVID, right? And that is just in your face, right? So what really is kind of funny is that canceling the Olympics might have been like a great move. Like, it would have allowed China, ironically, to save a lot of face. Hey, let's bail on these Olympics that they're just going to blow up in our face, right? But kind of like Japan, last year or whatever, it's like nobody wanted to. There's a lot of cachet to these Olympics, right? And it really matters to a lot of places. It matters a lot less in the United States, where LA is about to have the Olympics for the third time. It doesn't seem that cool, but it matters for a lot of countries, and it is a very different thing. So there's some inertia, and they want to keep it going. But God, if you knew all this stuff was coming, right? You saw the deterioration in relations, and you saw what COVID was doing, and it's very easy to see that this would be a massive sort of something that for hostile countries outside of China could use to poke at you, basically. As you look at the last 50 years of history, 60, 70 years of what the Olympics have been, it's like, well, that's all the 20th century, basically. That's what's been going on, right? So this kind of stuff is normal. It's not even just unexpected. It's like basically normal. So, but that didn't happen, right? So instead, China's stuck with these Olympics, where, like, let's just talk about what this is going to look like, right? COVID is blowing up everywhere. It's ruining, just getting around the United States right now is a disaster. The Olympics are in the middle of January, and this is going to be basically at the peak of a massive global spike in COVID, right? And you need to bring all the athletes into the country. You have to do all that kind of stuff, and basically it's going to be a lockdown Olympics, right? It's going to be all those policies that Beijing is using to try and maintain a lack of COVID anywhere in the country. It's going to have to do that with all these people flowing in and out, right? And there was already a problem in Japan. There was like, people were locked down. It was supposed to be not fun, right? All that kind of stuff. The athletes had to be staying in hotels and all that. And that doesn't really matter. It's more about the whole perception of this thing is going to be poor. It's going to show off China in its most sort of dictatorial and inflexible. And it's going to make it a forum for international judgment on everything that it's doing, on the fact that China gave the world COVID, on the fact that China has all these policies that it doesn't, it didn't really ever help the world move beyond COVID, right? Its vaccines don't work. At least now they don't work. They didn't really work before, but they don't work now. And you look in, it's going to be this sort of increasingly fortress China, like bunkered down place, which is a very common pattern in Chinese history. And it's going to be not a coming out party. It's going to be like, it's going to be like a lockdown party. It's going to be like, well, this is the last time the world really sees what China is like and what it's up to. I mean, it's going to be horrible commentary on everything China's about, right? Think about it. You have Chinese Olympics, and it's just going to be Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, COVID. It's just everything. Like, it's everything. Economic conflict, right? Military conflict. It just goes on and on, right? It's like it's just a great time to kick China when it's down. Also, I mean, this is the other thing I was saying. It's like that the Olympics, yes, it can be a great event to showcase your country. It could also be the opposite, right? And so China thought it would get the exact same thing again, and what's almost certainly going to get is literally the opposite. It's going to be, the 1-2 punch of COVID and the Olympics, and the COVID Olympics will basically, they might very well be sort of the sign as the beginning of a deep slide that is coming for China, like, you know, diplomatically, politically, economically, socially, all this stuff is on its way. And we don't know when it's going to start, but we do know that there's going to be key moments that you look back on, you think, okay, this is when it all began, right? So people talk about Evergrande. I have a big video on that, although I think the end of it got cut out. But this is, oh my God, the massive, insane Chinese property market. This thing is, maybe it's about to pop finally, right? That could easily be a major event, right? That could be one of those things that people remember. But you usually have sort of symbolic moments, right? And just like the Beijing Olympics were really insignificant in a lot of ways in 2008. They were totally insignificant, but they had this symbolic value to a lot of people, this symbolic place in a lot of people's memories. And it's very possible we might see the exact same thing here, because this could be, you look back in the Cold War, you look at all this stuff, and the Olympics were just a place for even back in the day, like this was a place for tit for tat battles between rivals, competitors, hostile countries. And we'll see how this goes, but this could easily be, like I was saying, just one of those key moments you look back on, you're like, wow, like China gave the world COVID, and then everybody came to China like in pieces and blah blah blah, not really allowed in to do these Olympics, and we'll be able to gauge how much it is soured on China, how much that is impacting China's sort of increasingly antagonistic relationship with everybody diplomatically, and how the government is going to increasingly respond to foreign issues, and also most importantly for the Chinese Communist Party is like how the relationship between state and society in China works. Like, how it's going to evolve going forward, how it's going to actually stabilize or continue to decline, basically, in a lot of ways. Like, right, how does this happen, right? If just the last thing, doing the lockdowns in 2020, like I said, that was a huge event that in the Chinese people's eyes, like, wow, our government is actually super competent. The rest of the world can't handle this, and we just knocked it out. That was really good. In August or whatever, there were people in there's a bunch of people, in a giant water park in Wuhan, right? And the rest of the world was locked down. It was terrible, right? So that was kind of what happened then. Now it's very different. Like, what if you're an average Chinese person and you see, oh wow, like obviously forget it. There's propaganda everywhere, so Chinese people are increasingly not seeing anything increasingly not seeing the accurate perceptions of what people all around the world think of China. That's one of the many things that's sort of being knocked, culled from their field of view, basically. But this one, it's like, well, what if you, assuming you could see all this stuff, like what if you suddenly see, like, oh my God, like the rest of the world is, there's scorn, there's like people are almost like despising China in a lot of ways, like, right? I mean, it's moved way beyond that in a lot of the world, right? People are super sick of China, but things, this could very well be the event that crystallizes it. So people should watch the Beijing Olympics to actually see not just how the athletes perform, but how all this is playing out, because it is very interesting. And there's a lot of things coming down the pipeline that are just not good. Like, it's really unfortunate. Everybody kind of feels like, they're just kind of tense these days and waiting for the next hammer to fall. And Omicron was obviously the next hammer to fall, but everyone feels like there's more, and there very well might be things that not public health related that are, pushing things even farther in the wrong direction. So that is unfortunate, but I hope this quick video was useful and helpful. And if you liked it, subscribe. If you, see more of content I produce, check out videos that are coming, check out podcast episodes that are on there, more that are coming. If you send me messages, send me stuff that you're curious about, that you want to know more about, do that. This is definitely a two-way street for anyone who's checking it out. So until next time, but in the meantime, Happy New Year, happy everything, happy holidays, happy Merry Christmas, all that. And have some fun while this unfortunate virus keeps hitting the world.